What if religion was not primarily about gods, rituals, or institutions, but about the inner forces that shape your emotions, decisions, and entire personality? What if your most personal spiritual instincts were the foundation of your behavior, your psychology, your reality? This is the provocative claim of William James, the father of American psychology and the author of the Varieties of Religious Experience. For James, religion is not something added to life, it is something that flows from the very center of it. It is the way we respond to the universe's wild uncertainty with trust, fear, surrender, and purpose. Religion, he argues, is a total reaction upon life, a personal, psychological, and existential revolution that begins inside and ripples outward. In this video, you'll explore how religious experience, whether mystical or moral, ecstatic or melancholic, transforms the structure of the mind. You'll discover how religious beliefs can shape not just what people think, but how they feel, how they act, how they endure. You'll see why James insists that religion cannot be reduced to theology or doctrine, but must be understood as lived experience, a dynamic interplay between the unseen and the real. This is not about converting anyone. It's about uncovering how the deepest layers of the self can be stirred, healed, and transformed by the religious impulse, whether you name it God, energy, or the more. Ready to see religion not as a system, but as a force of consciousness? Let's begin. The room is dim, the air still. A man kneels beside his bed, not out of obligation, not because someone is watching, but because something inside him demands it. His lips move in silence. His mind stretches towards something unseen, something more. He is not performing, he is reaching. This is religion in its rawest, most personal form. Not the church, not the sermon, but the solitary moment when the self is laid bare before the cosmos. William James called this the religious experience, and he treated it with profound seriousness. For him, religion was not an institutional arrangement or a list of commandments. It was an inner phenomena, direct experience of the more that seems to surround and penetrate the ordinary. Religion, he said, is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. In this view, the mind is not a closed system. It is porous. It is open to impressions, insights, and transformations that do not come from rational reflection alone. James did not care whether these experiences were provably real in the metaphysical sense. What mattered was their psychological power. They change people. They heal them. They inspire them to act, to forgive, to endure suffering, to create meaning in the face of chaos. And this is where James's psychology becomes radical. He does not ask whether religious experiences are true. He asks, what do they do to the person who has them? Do they bring peace? Do they energize? Do they unify the self and focus the will? Do they create new patterns of behavior? These, for James, are the real markers of religious truth, not logical consistency, but existential consequence. He studied the lives of saints, mystics, and ordinary believers with the precision of a scientist and the compassion of a philosopher. He observed that religious conversion often leads to profound psychological reorganization. The divided self becomes unified. A person who once felt lost or broken now feels anchored in a larger purpose. Their temperament shifts. Their actions align with newly embraced values. In James's terms, they become twice born reborn into a life infused with meaning. This is not to say religion is always benign. James acknowledged the pathological forms it can take: fanaticism, guilt obsession, spiritual pride. But even these distortions testify to religion's psychological potency. It is a force. It shapes identity, directs energy, reconfigures perception. It is not a passive belief, but an active engagement with the structure of reality. Imagine a katsinatantam alas. Woman walking through tragedy. She loses someone she loves. Her world fractures. But through prayer, meditation, or a sudden mystical insight, she feels connected to something larger than her suffering. That connection does not erase the pain, but it transfigures it. She begins to act again, to care again, to hope. Her behavior changes not because her beliefs are intellectually satisfying, but because they restore coherence to a shattered life. This is what James meant when he said that religion offers a new zest for life, and an assurance of safety, and a temper of peace. It is not that the world changes. It is that the mind's relation to the world is transformed. Religion, then, is not an escape from reality. It is an intensified mode of encountering it. And so, at its core, James's vision of religion is pragmatic and psychological. It asks not, what is the right dogma? But what is the lived effect of this belief on the person who holds it? Religion becomes a way of experimenting with reality, of inhabiting it more fully, more courageously, more tenderly. If you're still with us at this point, and these ideas resonate with something deep within you, something perhaps unspoken, consider liking this video and subscribing. You're not just watching. You're participating in a much older and deeper dialogue, the one between your mind and the more. The religious man, in William James's world, is not an escapist. He is not running from reality, but rather plunging more deeply into it. He feels more intensely, suffers more radically, acts with a sense of urgency that cannot be explained by reason alone. He perceives the universe not as a cold mechanism, but as something saturated with meaning, a meaning that reason alone cannot grasp. And this perception changes not only what he thinks, but how he behaves. James is clear. Religion, in its psychological essence, is a reorganization of the self. It takes the fragmented soul torn by doubt, sorrow, and distraction and reorients it around a deeper axis. He calls this transformation the unification of the divided self. The religious person is not someone who has all the answers. It is someone who has stopped running from the questions. Religion functions as a framework for self-integration. Not through imposed dogmas, but through lived experiences that grant vital value to existence. A feeling of reconciliation with the inevitable. A kind of courage in the face of suffering. A sense that, despite everything, life is worth living. These shifts are not mere sentiments, they translate into habits, decisions, ways of being in. The world. Here James introduces something essential. Religion is not merely what we believe. It is what we trust enough to act upon. That trust reshapes our thinking, but more importantly, it reshapes our conduct. Genuine religious belief, for James, is not measured by attendance at services or recitation of Scripture. It is measured by its power to stimulate new behavior, tolerance, compassion, patience, sacrifice. These are not accessories. They are the fruits of an inner revolution. James notes that those who undergo profound religious experiences often emerge with renewed moral energy. They are more resilient, more empathetic, more oriented toward the welfare of others. Not because they fear punishment or expect reward, but because they feel connected to a greater good. Religion for them is not a theory, it is a commitment. To live in harmony with a higher order that, though unseen, feels more real than anything visible. But James does not idealize. He recognizes that religion can just as easily become pathological, fueling fear, fanaticism, even cruelty. And yet, this does not negate its power. It confirms it. Religion reaches the foundations of personality. It can build or destroy, heal or distort. That is why James insists that the test of religion is not theological, but vital. What does it do to the person? This reframes the entire debate. The question is not whether religious beliefs are objectively provable. The question is whether they cultivate a life of greater dignity, depth, and direction. James proposes that we judge religion not by abstract standards, but by lived effects. Does it free or imprison? Does it enlarge or shrink the self? You begin to see, religion need not involve a temple or a sacred text. It can be found in the stillness of dawn, in the hand extended to a stranger, in forgiveness offered when there is no obligation. Behavior shifts because consciousness shifts. And consciousness shifts because the individual has encountered something, a presence, a force, a more, that defies easy definition but commands real allegiance. It starts with a rupture. A life once coherent begins to unravel. The job loses meaning. The relationship falters. The routines feel empty. You look in the mirror and sense not just fatigue, but fracture. Something inside you no longer fits. You are, in James's terms, a divided self. And this division is not just confusion, it is suffering. You are torn between the self you perform and the self that cries out for something more. William James does not pathologize this state, he sanctifies it. The divided self, he writes, is the beginning of transformation. It is the soul's honest reckoning with its own incoherence. And for many, it is the threshold of religious experience. Not religion as doctrine, not religion as tradition, but religion as crisis met by vision, as the psyche's search for a deeper unity. James traces how the divided self often leads to what he calls conversion. But conversion for him is not about switching creeds. It is about recentering the self around a new axis. The process is often agonizing. It can take years. It can involve despair, guilt, anxiety, isolation. But when it occurs, when the new center takes hold, it is as if the mind reorganizes itself around a new gravitational force. Suddenly, what once seemed chaotic begins to make sense. Not because the world has changed, but because the self has. The convert is not someone who finds all the answers. They are someone who accepts the mystery and yet commits. Their faith is not a conclusion, it is a stance. A way of standing in the world that brings coherence where there was once contradiction. James describes this as the emergence of a new zest for life. It is not giddiness, it is vitality. The self begins to act differently, not because it has been commanded to do so, but because it wants to. Its very source of motivation has shifted. And this change is not cosmetic, it is existential. The person becomes, in a deep sense, someone else. And what enables this transformation? Not logic, not argument, but experience. The experience of surrender. The experience of being touched by grace, by beauty, by an inner force that demands allegiance. James insists that religious transformation is not imposed from without. It is awakened from within. And once awakened, it spreads into every corner of life. The way the person speaks changes. The way they walk into a room changes. The way they endure suffering changes. They still face pain, uncertainty, disappointment, but now those experiences are framed differently. They are no longer seen as meaningless intrusions. They are seen as part of a larger pattern, a deeper story. This is not superstition. It is narrative reformation. And it reshapes behavior at the most intimate levels. James admired this not because he shared every belief of the converted, but because he saw what those beliefs made possible. He saw lives once aimless become purposeful. He saw fractured psyches find reintegration. He saw wounded people become healers. To him, this was evidence enough. The fruit of religion, if nourishing, justified the root. Of course, not all conversions are dramatic. Some are slow, unfolding over years. Some are quiet, never named, but all share a common element, a new center, a new source of value, meaning, and action. And that center, for James, is sacred not because it follows a creed, but because it restores life. So the question is not whether you are religious in the conventional sense. The question is, have you found a center that allows your divided self to unify? Have you encountered a vision that gives you the courage to change? Because if you have, then you know what James means. And if you haven't, perhaps that moment is still ahead, waiting, calling. It's the middle of the night. The world is silent. You lie awake, your mind restless, not with noise but with questions. The kind that don't ask to be answered, but to be lived. Is there more than this? Does anything really matter? Who am I beneath the masks, beneath the stories? William James understood that religion begins not in temples, but in these moments. It begins in the hush of honest doubt. Not in certainty, but in a longing that aches too deeply to ignore. He calls this the religious consciousness, a sensitivity to the hidden dimension of life, to the possibility that behind the veil of appearances, there is meaning. Not guaranteed, not proven, but felt. This consciousness is not exclusive to saints or mystics. It is democratic. It visits the broken, the desperate, the open. It arises in suffering, in awe, in love, in despair. It whispers in the background of ordinary life. And when we pay attention to it, it begins to reshape how we behave. It demands not ritual, but response. James insists, religious experience is intensely personal. No one else can have it for you. No one else can tell you how to interpret it. But when it comes, when it touches you, it calls for a kind of reorientation, a shift in attention, a willingness to see yourself not as an isolated ego, but as a participant in something larger, something unfinished. And what changes is not just your beliefs, but your actions. You forgive more easily. You listen more attentively. You suffer without bitterness. You begin to live as if your life matters in ways you cannot fully articulate. This is not sentimentality. It is power. It is the quiet revolution of the self, initiated by an unseen presence. James warns that the modern mind, trained in skepticism, often dismisses such moments as delusion. But he urges us to listen anyway, to let the experience speak for itself. Because if it brings coherence, courage, compassion, then it is, in his terms, true enough. He asks us to stop demanding universal proof and start honoring personal consequence. A religion that enables someone to face death without terror, to forgive without resentment, to love in the face of betrayal. That religion, James says, has proven its worth, no matter its metaphysical claims. This is why he describes religion as a total reaction upon life. It is not a side dish. It is a fundamental way of being. It involves your body, your emotions, your will, and when it becomes real, it becomes impossible to separate from your identity. You are what you revere. You become what you surrender to. And so the question is not just whether religion is real. The deeper question is, what would your life look like if you truly lived as if it were sacred? Not in the sense of obeying rules or clinging to dogma, but in the sense of treating each moment, each person, each breath as part of a meaningful whole? James would argue that to live this way, even without certainty, is to live more fully, more honestly, more courageously. It is to respond to the more with reverence, even when you cannot name it, because ultimately, religion for James is not a belief system. It is an existential rhythm, a way the soul learns to dance with mystery. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that nothing outside you has changed, yet everything inside you feels different. The street you've always walked looks the same. the faces are familiar, the duties unchanged. But the way you move, the way you see, the way you feel your own existence, it's as if a veil has been lifted. You are not a new person. But you are no longer the same. For William James, this is precisely the kind of shift that religion, in its psychological essence, can induce. And what changes most clearly, most visibly, is behavior. But James insists that we must understand this behavior not as conformity, not as mere obedience to moral codes, but as the external echo of internal transformation. He points to the stories of those who, after a spiritual awakening, become more forgiving, more generous, more resilient, not because they are told to be, but because they now see the world differently. They see others not as enemies or competitors, but as fellow travelers. They see suffering not just as something to avoid, but as something that can be transfigured. They act not out of duty alone, but out of a deep inner necessity. James writes, "The best fruits of religion have always been found in its encouragement to a better life." And by better, he does not mean more comfortable. He means more courageous, more integrated, more aligned with what he calls the strenuous mood, a way of living that embraces difficulty, sacrifice, and purpose. Religious belief, when it is authentic, produces a behavioral clarity that no abstract reasoning can rival. It gives the believer a center from which to act. This center may be mysterious, it may defy articulation, but its effects are unmistakable. The person who once drifted through life now acts with direction. The one who once feared judgment now radiates compassion. The one who once hoarded control now surrenders, and in surrender finds strength. James is fascinated by this paradox, that religious experience often produces stronger individuals, not weaker ones. Not because it arms them with certainties, but because it roots them in a conviction that withstands the chaos of life. They can be shaken, but not destroyed. They may suffer, but they are not lost. Their behavior reflects not perfection, but orientation. They know where they are going even if they cannot always see the path. This behavioral change, James argues, is the most reliable test of religion's power. Forget creeds. Forget theological disputes. Look at the life. What does it reveal? Is the person more loving, more open, more ethically serious, more willing to bear their own burden and help carry the burdens of others? James believed that religious experience, when genuine, empowers people to act more nobly, not because they are escaping the world, but because they are more deeply engaged with it. They do not retreat into fantasy. They walk into reality with eyes wide open, heart engaged, and spirit intact. So take a moment now, not to ask what you believe, but to ask, what does your belief, whatever it may be, cause you to do? That is James's central challenge. Belief that does not lead to action, to change, to responsibility, is inert. But belief that animates, that propels, that binds you to others and to the future, that belief is alive. And it is from that kind of belief that a different world might emerge. The light slants through the window just right. The room is quiet. You sit at your desk, not because you must, but because something calls. It's not a voice, not a command. It's a sense, a pull, a reverence for the work before you. This is not productivity. It's devotion. William James knew this mood well. He described it not with theological terms, but with psychological clarity. He understood that when religious experience is real, it spills over. It cannot be confined to temples or prayers. It seeps into gestures, into habits, into labor. The sacred becomes part of the ordinary, not by changing the world, but by transforming the way the self engages with it. James observed that religious individuals often report a sense of consecration, a feeling that their daily actions, even the smallest, are imbued with purpose. This sense is not always conscious, but it manifests in behavior. It manifests in how one greets others, and how one listens, and how one endures pain, and how one rejoices. Life becomes not just something to survive, but something to serve. And this service is not rooted in fear. It is not about earning favor or avoiding punishment. It is rooted in connection, in the sense that there is something greater than the ego, something larger than personal desire. James calls this the more, and he refuses to define it. What matters is not what you call it, but what it does to you. Does it make you more generous? More honest? More capable of love? Then it is real, in James's pragmatic sense. He challenges us to evaluate religion not by metaphysical proof, but by fruits. And the fruits he values most are moral, courage, humility, fidelity, tenderness. This view reframes religion entirely. It becomes not a system to defend, but a resource to live from, a fountain from which your actions draw their clarity. Your duties are no longer mechanical. They are offerings. Your relationships are no longer strategic. They are sacred. You stop asking, "What do I get?" and begin asking, "What do I give?" And here James makes one of his most beautiful observations. The religious life, at its best, produces not superiority, but simplicity. Not pride, but peace. Not certainty, but trust. It teaches you to act not with answers, but with faith. Faith that the smallest kindness matters. Faith that truth unfolds through time. Faith that even in the face of suffering, there is dignity in showing up. This is not passivity. It is what James calls the strenuous mood. The resolve to live, with full commitment in a world that offers no guarantees. The will to believe that your life counts, that your choices resonate, even when you don't see the outcome. This will is not naive, it is disciplined. And it transforms not just what you think, but what you do, day after day. So consider, what would change in your life if you approached each task, each conversation, each decision not as a burden, but as a form of devotion? This is not about being religious in the institutional sense. It is about embodying the religious attitude, reverence for the real, faith in the possible, and a quiet readiness to act with integrity even when no one is watching. For James, that is religion at its most powerful, not when it imposes from above, but when it wells up from within and flows outward through your hands, your words, your steps. There's a moment subtle, almost imperceptible, when you realize you're not the same person you were a year ago. You don't react the same way. You don't cling to the same grudges. You don't run from silence the way you used to. Something has shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply. William James would recognize this as the slow work of religious consciousness, the transformation that doesn't explode, but accumulates. It's in the repetition of choices, the repetition of attention, the repetition of trust. Religious experience, when real, does not end with a revelation. It begins there. And what follows is a life reshaped by that encounter, not in ecstasy, but in endurance. This is the paradox James loved to explore, that the deepest forms of religion are not found in the dramatic, but in the consistent. Not in the spectacle, but in the quiet refusal to surrender to cynicism. The religious person, he says, becomes a vessel not for grand miracles, but for daily fidelity. Fidelity to values, to presence, to the invisible. It's here that behavior becomes not just ethical, but sacred. You begin to notice how you speak to others, how you forgive, how you hold space for the suffering of those around you. Your moral life is no longer separate from your spiritual life. They are the same. And this change is not always easy. James knew that religion could introduce tension. The pull between who you were and who you are becoming can be excruciating. The gap between the ideal and the actual can lead to despair, but it can also lead to effort. And for James, effort is a sign of vitality. He speaks often of volitional habits, the patterns of attention and choice that shape your character. Religion, in its psychological essence, fortifies those habits. It gives you a reason to keep trying. It doesn't promise perfection. It promises direction. And here lies one of his boldest insights. Religion gives people the strength to live with contradiction, not by resolving it, but by affirming something higher through it. The world remains imperfect. You remain imperfect. But you act anyway. You love anyway. You forgive anyway. Because something within you says, this matters. James calls this the moral equivalent of war, the strenuous life, the life lived in full recognition of suffering and in full defiance of despair. A life animated not by pleasure or ease, but by meaning. Meaning born of commitment. Commitment born of belief. So what does this look like in practice? It looks like choosing silence over distraction, choosing generosity over suspicion, choosing to say yes to life even when it's unclear what that yes will cost. It's the courage to believe, not because belief is easy, but because belief is necessary for action. And yet James never turns belief into dogma. He insists that belief must always be tested by its consequences. Does it produce love? Does it sustain you through loss? Does it deepen your engagement with the world? Then it is worth keeping. If not, if it hardens you, isolates you, degrades your capacity to relate, then it must be let go. Religion, in James's view, is not about preservation. It is about regeneration. So pause here and ask yourself, what? Habits of attention, of speech, of presence. What patterns of being are you cultivating, perhaps unconsciously, through what you believe? Because those patterns are your life, and your beliefs, whether sacred or secular, are the soil in which they grow. There is a kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout, doesn't demand applause. It simply endures. It shows up day after day in people who have suffered deeply and yet remain kind, who have lost much and yet still give, who have every reason to withdraw and yet still love. William James found in religion the secret behind this kind of resilience. He observed that those who live religiously, not always devout, not always orthodox, but inwardly surrendered to something greater, develop what he called spiritual fortitude. This is not optimism. It is not denial. It is the capacity to remain alive to meaning, even when life becomes unbearable. This kind of resilience, James argued, is not based on certainty. It is based on trust. Trust that life, in its vast incompleteness, still offers something worth engaging. Religion, then, becomes not an escape from pain, but a container for it. A context in which suffering does not cancel value, but reveals it. He tells of saints and mystics who, amidst physical decay, social isolation, or intense grief, report not bitterness but peace, not emptiness but fullness. These are not metaphors. These are transformations of consciousness. Experiences in which the self no longer clings to control, but surrenders, and in surrender, becomes strong. What changes here is not the outer condition. It is the interior relationship to that condition. The religious person, in James's view, does not need the storm to end. They need to feel that the storm is not meaningless, that their endurance is not wasted, that their pain is not without witness. And it is from this inner shift that behavior transforms, not through willpower alone, but through a renewed sense of being carried. A trust that says, even when I do not understand, I can still respond, I can still act, I can still love. James calls this the conversion of the heart, a redirection of the emotional core. It is not always dramatic. It can be so subtle that no one sees it but you, but its effects radiate. You become a different presence in the world, less reactive, more grounded, less consumed by fear, more moved by compassion. This is what James found so remarkable. Religion turns inward transformation into outward grace, not performatively, but naturally. The person who once acted from scarcity now acts from abundance. The one who once needed to win now seeks to understand. The one who once feared the unknown now welcomes it as part of the whole. This, for James, is the highest fruit of religious life, not visions, not doctrines, but a new kind of character. A being capable of holding complexity without collapsing, of moving forward without knowing the full path, of offering themselves without demand for return. It's not a heroism of conquest. It's a heroism of continuity. And it comes not from certainty, but from a faith lived through behavior. So ask yourself, what do you do? How do you live when nothing is certain, but something within you refuses to give up? Because in that refusal, in that sacred defiance, you may find not the absence of pain, but the presence of strength. And that, James would say, is religion at its deepest, not belief in abstractions, but a behavior sustained by something holy, even if unnamed. A man walks alone through a forest. There are no signs, no paths, no voices to guide him. Only the trees, the wind, and the steady rhythm of his steps. He does not know where he is going, but he keeps walking. Why? William James might say, because he believes there is something worth finding, not because he has proof, but because, deep within, he has chosen to trust the journey. This is the final shape of religious behavior, not certainty, not clarity, but commitment. James never reduced religion to belief alone. He insisted that its real test was always in life, in what we endure, in how we act when no one is watching, in what we build even when the outcome is unclear. Religious experience is not something that visits you once. It is something that invites you daily to live differently. He knew that such living is not easy. It requires the will to face ambiguity, the courage to choose without guarantees, the grace to suffer without losing hope. But he believed, with all the force of his philosophy, that such living is more real, not less. In the end, James leaves. Used not with answers, but with a challenge. What would it mean for you to live as though the unseen matters more than the visible? Not because it's provable, but because it makes you more alive, more human, more whole. If this video has helped illuminate that possibility for you, if it has sparked a new way of thinking, or feeling, or believing, then let that matter. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with 3 friends who are also walking, uncertain, but still believing. Because in the end, religion is not what we believe alone. It is how we walk together through mystery.